Thank you for joining us, everyone. This is Furthering Global Talent Initiatives in an Increasingly Fractured Climate. I'm thrilled to be here. And of course, we have our esteemed panelists here. Let me just introduce them very quickly, and I'll give you a brief scene setter on where we are with everything. We've got Joy Chen, CEO of the Multicultural Leadership Institute, former Deputy Mayor of LA. Jeanine Conley Daves, the Office and Managing Shareholder of Littler Mendelssohn's New York office, as well as Susan Reid, Managing Director and Global Head of Talent and a member of Morgan Stanley's Management Committee. So I think I'm just going to give a brief history lesson here and just kind of get us up to speed on where we are when it comes to DEI. I get bored of hearing my own voice, so I'll try to keep this really short. When you look at DEI, the work really started in the mid-1960s in response to the civil rights movement and racial integration in workplaces. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, that was an important turning point because for the first time ever, it mandated that businesses may no longer discriminate based on race, gender, national origin, religion, or age. So in other words, it made it illegal to discriminate in hiring and promotion. So we're gonna fast forward to 2020 because of course it's been a bumpy road after that. Summer 2020, as all of you can attest to, was really a watershed moment following the murder of George Floyd. DEI initiatives, which had been gaining some momentum, really became a priority. Companies raced to issue statements condemning Floyd's death. They promised to reform their workplaces. They promised to put real money behind efforts to narrow the gender pay gap, to address racial justice. There are words thrown around like racial reckoning and inflection point. I don't mean thrown around, but they were brought up regularly, and this was a priority. This continued through 2021 and through the first part of 2022. And the context, I think, I work for Bloomberg, and the context here for all of this is the economy was doing very well in that it was a very tight labor market. Companies were hiring, they were not really firing. Employees had a lot of leverage. So it felt like management was really listening to them. And you saw it in the continued work from home and the hybrid work environment, that employees were able to get their voices heard in a way perhaps they weren't in worse economic times. Of course, in March 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to address rising inflation. And as a result of that, there was a lot of talk about, oh, the economy is going to slow down. Is there going to be a recession? When there's a recession, companies tighten their spending, and that meant leaner times on Wall Street and in the tech industry. DEI became an obvious or an easy place for companies to perhaps make cuts or not spend as much. They reduced their fundings for employee resource groups. Companies gave less financial support to people who are attending recruiting events to get more black talent or Asian talent or Hispanic talent. And of course, as Perry referenced as well, we had an increase in anti-Asian hate at this time as well. How many people were scared to walk to the office or even leave their homes because of what might happen on the streets? Now, let's move to summer of 2023, last summer. The Supreme Court effectively banning using race as a factor in college admissions. The plaintiffs argued that in trying to achieve diversity in admissions, Harvard discriminated against Asian American applicants. And I bring up Asian Americans because we're here talking about how this affects Asian Americans. And the linkage to the corporate world is that in the Harvard case, almost 70 companies filed a brief saying that they worried the end of affirmative action for colleges would drastically reduce corporate diversity. And we saw that once the ruling came down, legal experts warned that DEI initiatives could be the next target. And of course, that is kind of what happened. 2023 into 2024, there was a conservative-led backlash against DEI and all forms of what critics called woke capitalism, reverse discrimination. They all threatened legal challenges. You saw what happened with Disney World, with Harvard. Companies start to say less to avoid becoming a target for Republican lawmakers or conservative groups. I work at Bloomberg, and according to data that we compiled, mentions of DEI on earnings conference calls and at conferences among the 3,000 biggest companies, biggest publicly traded companies, tumbled 54% from a year earlier to the lowest since 2018. There's also been a spike in demand for lawyers who specialize in DEI because companies were saying, oh, I need an audit on what we've been building so far. Let's revisit all the DEI initiatives we launched, board diversity, socially conscious investing. We need to assess the risk and figure out whether any changes need to be made. How do we protect ourselves? Of course, that's one side. On the flip side, you also have companies looking for ways to continue their diversity efforts, perhaps more quietly, without putting it out in the spotlight, right? And of course, adding to this, you have prominent voices speaking up. You have Elon Musk, Bill Ackman, the billionaire hedge fund manager, publicly criticizing DEI strategies. On the flip side, you have Mark Cuban, the billionaire entrepreneur, championing DEI policies. So all of that is going on. And of course, it reaches the universities as well. The October 7 attacks by Hamas on Israel led to protests on campus. Congress starts holding hearings. Claudine Gay resigns as president of Harvard. I bring this up because certain members of Congress were looking to push out leaders of elite universities that they saw as engines of left-wing indoctrination, the enemy, wokeism, all of that. In the corporate world, you have Tesla removing language about minority workers and supporting ERGs from its regulatory filings that it files with the SEC. In February 2024, Zoom, you know the company where we all have to get on and hold our meetings. It was founded and led by an Asian American. They eliminated their DEI team. That's not to say they're not doing anything around it, but that's kind of a symbolic move. And in terms of moving forward, the context for why this matters now, we're coming up to an election in November, right? Maybe we'll get the return of Donald Trump 2.0. And if so, where do Asians and Asian Americans fit in with all of that? We know that they were a big swing vote in the 2020 elections, increasingly in places like Georgia. Certainly, they're a big part of the electorate in New York and California, reliably blue states. But in states that are turning purple, they could play a big role. We can play a big role. We also know Asians is a massive, massive group, right? Culturally, some are culturally and socially conservative, especially those who might have fled communist regimes like China, like Vietnam. So when it comes to what this means for AAPI workers, and I was talking about this earlier with Joy, we have some Asian women up here. We have some Asian women who are speaking. There's a stereotype that they work really hard. They're well prepared. We're well prepared for this panel discussion. We're workhorses, but are we leaders? That's a big question mark. As mentioned, we're not a monolith. The challenges are nuanced and diverse. Everyone's kind of lumped as Asian, but are you Southeast Asian? Are you South Asian? Are you East Asian? Have you been here for generations? Do you have family members who were sent to internment camps? Have your parents immigrated over despite the Chinese Exclusion Act? Or did you just come here 3 months ago or 3 years ago because you went to grad school and then you ended up getting married and you found work here and now you have kids here? It's a big, big, broad group, right? And despite efforts at assimilation, no matter what, when you look at us, you think we're a foreigner. People who aren't Asian certainly do. How many times has anyone been asked, no, where are you from? Where are you really from? Not New York, not California, where are you really from? So the other thing that often gets ignored as well, especially as this group is so large, is that Asian Americans have the most income inequality of any major racial or ethnic group in the United States. Not everyone is a doctor, lawyer, or accountant. So to that end, let's get on with our conversation. I hope I haven't bored you all with all of that. Let's start off here because when I was telling my colleagues that I'm coming here to moderate a conversation on DEI, one of the first reactions I got from people was, wait, is that still a thing? Do people care about that? Because I thought, it's not really a priority anymore. So let's start there. Is DEI still relevant and in what way? Because there is this perception, certainly in many corners of the corporate world, that perhaps, as Susan mentioned, it might be on life support. Susan, why don't we start with you?
And I'm here to say definitively DE&I is not on life support. And I think, those of us who are in the room today, folks who may watch this after the fact, all of us care deeply, and that's why we're here. I mean, look, think about a firm like Morgan Stanley. We have 80,000 employees all over the world. We increasingly have employees who sit in India and in Japan and of course, all across Europe and, of course, in the United States. And so when you think about that, right, when I think about the class that's coming to join us just in a few weeks, the 2,500 students from, colleges and universities all across the U.S., for us, DE&I is still critically important, right? Everybody who comes to Morgan Stanley, I mean, we talk a lot about, there's a human side to DE&I and then there's a commercial side. The human side is everybody matters, and hopefully we'll talk about that more. And the commercial side is we're hiring people who we want to thrive and do well. They're going to contribute to the commercial success of the firm. And so from my perspective, DE&I is still very much alive and well, both personally and at Morgan Stanley, and we're still showing up in the DE&I space.
Joy, what about you? What are you seeing? How would you answer, how is DEI still relevant today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Susan, for those remarks and also for that very masterful overview, I think, and framing of these issues. I love the way that Susan said we need to think about the human side as well as the commercial side of the business. And I think that when I was deputy mayor of Los Angeles, one of the things that I really learned is that it's not enough just to have great policy programs and solutions that work. It also really matters how you message about it. And I think that given the divisions right now, it's so important in order to move these programs forward that we find a way to message how these programs contribute to the commercial success of our firms. Susan, we were talking earlier upstairs in the green room about how there are many people who feel left out, frankly, in the DEI, and we do need to ensure that they all are on board, especially our company leaders. And so one way that I think, we've been doing it, that I found has been working for us is to really think hard about what are the company leaders' priorities right now. You're saying interest rates are still high. Companies, we don't know where the economy is going. There's so much uncertainty in the world. There's so much uncertainty, political uncertainty in the country. Companies are looking for sources of efficiency. So the way that we've been saying it is, look, Asians are 30, 40, 50% of your workforce. They're on your payroll. So as you seek efficiency, let's find ways to ensure that every Asian employee is able to contribute to their full potential. So rather than let's find ways to remove the glass ceiling for Asians, let's find ways to ensure that they are contributing fully to your corporate results and profits. And we found that has been just, a much easier sell in getting CEOs on board.
Jeanine, what are you seeing?
Absolutely. D&I is still very relevant. And I think as an employment lawyer, what I'm seeing is that clients are coming to us and saying, look, we are going to do this. And I think part of that is that we are well past, there have been so many studies, the McKinsey study, Harvard Business Review, Deloitte has a study showing how important having diverse teams are to any organization. And we know that's the case. It's important to ensure that companies can service their customers or their clients. And so, in fact, I am absolutely seeing clients say, look, we're going to continue our D&I programming. What exactly, do we need to do? And companies are taking the prudent measures of reviewing their programs to make sure there are no programs that have risks and they're obviously, it's all about risk tolerance, but DEI programs are still alive, and we actually did a survey, and I can talk more about that later as well.
All right, that sounds great. I guess one thing I want to bring up here, and again, in talking to people at my job about how I was going to moderate this panel, and it was at the Asia Society, one question they had is, wait, how do Asians fit in with DEI? Because we're kind of the forgotten group. We're not underrepresented in a lot of workplaces, certainly not at the entry level. And we're definitely not underrepresented at colleges, we know that. So is DEI helping Asians, or are Asians kind of suffering or being penalized in DEI efforts? Is this a zero-sum game? I'd like to address that a little bit because it depends, the answer depends on whether you are a newly arrived transplant or you've been here for generations and what kind of Asian you are. Joy, why don't I let you take that one?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question to address because people often say, well, Asians are so successful, why would you even be talking about Asians when it comes to DEI. And that's why I find it helpful to say, well, yes, in fact, Asians suffer from an age 30 problem. Yes, Asians are super successful. We all know Asians have very high rate of going to college. Asians are the most educated group in America. So Asians are very successful at getting an education and getting entry-level jobs at some of our biggest and best companies. But the problem is, once it's time to get promoted, Asians are the least promoted group in corporate America, despite all that education hard work. So basically, for just when it's time for Asians to start to reap the benefits of all that education hard work, and just when it's time to soar, they plummet, and their career prospects are the lowest of anyone in corporate America.
And Jeanine, you've seen this as well. You had a great statistic for me earlier.
Yes, particularly in the law firm context, which I'm obviously very aware of, even though Asian Americans are the highest in terms of any minority at law firms, they have the largest numbers of any law firms, they actually have the highest attrition rate. And the partner to associate ratio is the lowest of any minority group. And we still see in the law firm context that the number of equity partners for across the board for all minority groups is very, very low. And just so you have an understanding, typically when you get elevated, there are income partners, there are equity partners. Income partners are paid on an income basis, like a salary basis, and equity partners are paid equity of the firm. And so obviously your ability to make more money is higher when you're an equity partner. And those averages are somewhere around 5%, even though you see that the numbers are obviously increasing in the law firm context for Asian Americans.
So it's easy for Asians or Asian Americans to get in the door, but it's hard for them to take the escalator or the elevator up.
Yeah, exactly what Joy was saying in other contexts as well.
Yeah. Susan, what are you seeing?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think about this in two ways. One is pick any community, Asian community, Black community, white community. Access, privilege, and the ability to thrive is not concentrated. And if you look at any community, you will have people from each of those communities who are thriving, and then others who are absolutely suffering. If you live in New York, all you have to do is, start on Park Avenue and go all the way downtown, and you'll see the difference particularly for the Asian community and how people are navigating their lives, right? And so we know that being Asian doesn't mean that you automatically have access, privilege, and that you're thriving. And we need to get our heads around that. There are plenty of studies that show that. Coquel did a study on the AAPI community a few years ago. Pick it up, take a look at it. We partner with Girls Leadership. They just did a study on AAPI girls that shows that, by the way, like this silencing happens very, very early in life. So the data is there, as Jeanine said. But the other thing that I would say is, this point around even when you've quote unquote made it, you still have challenges, and that's very, very real. I think about the post George Floyd. Not that there's ever a post George Floyd, by the way, and even in the wake of the anti-Asian violence, we had a lot of conversations at the firm around this particular issue, and we heard heartbreaking stories of very successful people, Black people, Asian people, who within the four walls of a Morgan Stanley are seemingly thriving, but without that context of I'm a managing director at Morgan Stanley, they leave and they go to other communities where they're absolutely treated differently, right?
As a partner.
The Black colleague who is a managing director at Morgan Stanley, who's doing well at Morgan Stanley and seen as an MD, goes to the Hamptons and is treated poorly because she's seen as not belonging in that community. And the AAPI community absolutely experiences that as well. And so I think within the context of the DE&I efforts that we all do, we have to remember that access privilege and the ability to thrive is not equally distributed across any community, and that the part of the work we have to do is to look for those communities that are hurting and very intentionally work to solve for those issues.
Very well said. I think one thing within the Asian community, we talk about how broad it is and how someone might be second generation versus someone who perhaps came to the US for grad school and is now working here. A lot of the newly arrived Asians, the Asian transplants, don't see DEI as something that includes them. They're thinking, I have my own networks. I have 5 different WeChat groups that I belong to, and we take care of each other. And those networks, I can build my connections through them. The DEI program that my company talks about, I don't see it benefiting me, and I don't even see it addressing me because I know that there's plenty of Asians here, and I'm doing pretty well, so I'm good. How do we get past that? Is this something that you run up against? Susan, I'll put this to you first. Do you see this at companies where a certain cohort of Asians are saying, but I don't see how this relates to me at all?
Yeah, not just with the Asian community. We see this challenge with other communities as well. And so I think, again, part of the work is how do you pull people in? I think it's unfortunate that so many times the starting point is trauma, right? So anti-AAPI violence happens and you get a lot of people coming forward finally and saying, I'm hurting. And then you get people who might not see themselves as part of DE&I saying, wait a minute, I actually do need to be part of this effort, right? I'm hoping that we find a way collectively to move away from inviting people or having people raise their hand to be involved because of trauma. That's a horrible way to come to the table. I do think the work there, Scarlet, is around the I piece of DE&I, the inclusion piece, and we've been having a lot of conversations around this at the firm. How do you build efforts that encourage people from all walks of life to come to the table, and find a Wi-Fi, what's in it for me, for people from all walks of life. And I will tell you that is not an easy thing to do. Again, we have people who come to it because of trauma, but we have people who come to it because as an observer of the trauma, they say, okay, wait a minute, there's a Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi is maybe I can actually help. The Wi-Fi is maybe I didn't see myself as part of that community, and now I do. I think we all need to do a little bit more work to figure out how we find the what's in it for me for people so that the inclusion piece becomes, more enhanced and we get more people to the table.
I totally agree with that point. I think that when you have some of these maybe new immigrants who are saying, well, I go to these ERG meetings and they're, maybe they feel left out. Maybe it's the second generation all talking about whatever their things that they're interested in. And so it's not serving their needs. And I think that if we want everyone to be able to participate in any new initiative, we know this from politics, right? The way to address them is to serve their needs, exactly like Susan said. And I think that whereas the diversity part has caused a lot of division of DEI, the inclusion part, everyone needs. Everyone needs to be included. And that is a great place that we can do more work. And I think that a lot of our in corporate America, our initiatives, the DEI initiatives in the last few years has been around diversity. But diversity alone is not going to solve any of the problems that we're facing. In fact, diversity alone, just the way that humans naturally interact, we all naturally just connect more with folks like us. So unless we actively set up inclusion programs that work, diversity alone will actually lead to greater lack of belonging and greater inequity. So I think, as Susan said, the answer lies in really focusing more on inclusion and also inclusion programs that actually are meeting the needs of people. And then we've seen, when we create the inclusion programs that actually work, people are rushing to sign up.
Scarlet, can I just add that,
Please, yeah.
Just a small point on what everyone said, and there's a group called SHRM that said it, I think, best. The head of that organization, human resources organization, was that diversity really does get people in the door. We have seen, particularly with these more junior generations, that diversity is so critical for them in an organization. So if you are seeking top talent, that is so important. But again, as both Joy and Susan said, it's inclusion that keeps them in the door, that keeps them there. And when you think about that at law firms, being the highest minority in terms of numbers, but having the highest attrition rate. So you're getting people in the door, but those people are leaving. And then you have the costs and everything that go into when people leave, and you're losing that institutional knowledge. And so recognizing, and I think that, not everyone recognizes, yes, you do have your networks and you can build off your networks, but it's when you hit a wall that you realize that the inclusive part of it is so critical and so important, and that those historically underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, are hitting the same walls. We're seeing that particularly in the legal context.
And that's something that Joy will be talking about momentarily, but I want to build on what you were saying about hitting that wall, because I think for a lot of Asian immigrants, newly arrived Asians, and also other members of the AAPI community, DEI has become kind of a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
It seems like if we're going to make more room for other people, that means less room for me. And certainly that's been the case for...
white men feel that
and
way.
a lot of white men feel that way. So, and we see that most... clearly in something like college admissions, where the demand is only growing, but the spaces are limited. And so there's this feeling of, I end up giving up something in order for to serve the greater good of diversity. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Can I just comment on that? I think that's one of the big problems with this whole DE&I issue. And look, we need to build bigger tables, and we need to bring more chairs to the room. I mean, the reality is that there's room for more people. I think about, leadership at Morgan Stanley, and when I look at our management committee now is much more diverse. Why? Because our former CEO, our outgoing CEO, was very intentional about saying, I'm going to add more people to the management committee because I want a more diverse management committee. We could have kept that management committee small, and we could have restricted it just to, a few key people. But now I serve on the management committee. We have a number of other people who serve on the management committee. What did he do? He made the table bigger. He brought more chairs to the table. And so this idea that the room is too small, there aren't enough opportunities, it comes from this scarcity mindset that if you get more, I get less. And we live in a world where the economy expands daily and contracts, of course, but it expands daily. And so I think we've got to figure out also how to get away from the scarcity mindset and get to a place where we see abundance and we see the opportunity to make the room bigger, the table bigger, and bring more chairs to the table.
Yeah.
Jeanine, you want to add to that, or?
No, I just agree completely. Yep. I mean, you were talking earlier about the scarcity mindset, and I think that's what leads to a lot of the issues that we are certainly dealing with. I think that organizations are trying to tackle that, like Morgan Stanley, like organizations and other clients that I work with, by just as well increasing the pools. Mm-hmm. Increasing the pools, increasing the slates to make sure that you have a diverse group that you're looking at when you're hiring, and bringing people into companies as well. And so I love this concept of just, expand the table. And that in and of itself is a big part of how I think we can get to the right place in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I have one more question before we bring Joy in to give her presentation. How do we incorporate DEI in such a way that it helps drive the business's goals, which is grow its top line, grow its sales, grow its bottom line, grow its profit? Because oftentimes it feels like its own program on the side that's a nice to have, that can be a need to have in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, but then goes back to being do we really need this when the economy is perhaps starting to shrink, or there are concerns that we need to cut costs because the economy may start going south? Right. Joy, let me pose that to you first.
Well, I'll be sharing some specific ideas on how we're doing that sort of from a policy standpoint. But I think that part of this is that, I talk to CEOs confidentially who are not nearly as progressive as at Morgan Stanley, and who say things like, my DEI team, they're like political activists. They're not really aligned. I mean, I think that sometimes they hired DEI people who maybe don't have a strong business background, who've never worked in operations, and who don't have credibility with the internal leaders. And so there's a perception that they're not aligned, and the programs that they're creating aren't really aligning to the strategic goals of top line growth, bottom line performance, productivity. And so it's been sort of hobbling, I think, the DEI execution at a lot of these places, that they'll remain underfunded because it's sort of a nice to have. It becomes more of a PR thing because it's not seen as, it's not seen as really contributing to the corporate goals. So it'll always be underfunded, and then they'll be just hobbled because they won't get the buy-in from the other business leader partners that, like Susan has. I mean, she has to partner with every single business unit head to be effective. But if you don't have the credibility of someone like a Susan, then I think it becomes very difficult.
Jeanine, how does DEI help bring in more billable hours, more clients, as opposed to take away from time spent with those clients?
Well, I'll say, I think what's really interesting, and this just happened last week, and it was more generational, and not so much generational, but it was one of our junior attorneys that brought up such a great idea on a case that me and the senior attorney we really hadn't thought of. We had thought about it earlier in the case and hadn't come back to it. And she brought it back up, and it made such a big difference in the case. And we can't service our clients without having that diversity of mind, diversity of thoughts. It's impossible. All of us bring so many different things to the table. And on that same case, I jumped on it. It was a trial, and I hadn't been on the case. And just my eyes seeing it from a diverse perspective and coming to the table with different ideas made such a big difference in how we dealt with that case. And we recognize that in the law firm context, that having that type of diversity of ideas is so terribly critical. And as you said, it brings more to the table when you're able to service your clients in that way.
Do your clients demand it from you?
They do. Yes.
What did they say?
They absolutely do. They say we want to see more diverse teams because they know it's as I said, in terms of the studies that have been done, I think we've gotten to that point where we're over thinking that diversity does not matter. It absolutely matters in everything that you do, whether you're selling a product, whether you're selling services as we are, it absolutely matters. And so they say, we want to see diverse teams.
Do the customers at the firms that you work at, Susan, make it a point to ask for diverse members of your organization to interact with them?
Oh, absolutely. There are now countless stories of walking into meetings with prospective clients and having them make the point that, the diversity of the team is a factor in who they pick to do business with. But the other thing I would say is from a commercial standpoint, if you don't have diverse teams, you risk leaving, or staff who embrace diversity and inclusion. I'll make that point as well. You risk losing millions and millions of dollars. I think about, again, a study that was done years ago about wealth, and it focused particularly on women who had wealth and how underserved they were, quite frankly, by the financial advisory community, right? And not getting the time and attention, not being tapped. And the millions of dollars that were out there that women held. And because financial advisors are often trained to think of the client as a man, they're not looking to women. And, us being able to bring that study into our business, for example, and saying to our wealth business, hey, you need to be aware that you might be missing an opportunity here because you're not serving women, or you're not serving, I think about the number of businesses. The Hispanic community and the AAPI community are absolutely leading the charge on creation of new businesses in the US. And so if you miss that point, you miss the opportunity. You miss the commercial opportunity. Again, for me, DE&I is about the human side and the commercial side. But on the commercial side, you miss the opportunity if you don't have teams that are either diverse or teams that see the value of diversity.
I think a lot of people in the Asian American Pacific Islander community recognize the value that they play in being represented and a face of diversity. I guess the question is, and this is based on someone I spoke with at my office, Asians are useful in that we help check the box for companies that are trying to increase their non-white headcount, but there's a concern that there's a tokenization. The team is diverse. It has its Black woman, its Asian man, its gay man. Yeah. But after that, who's leading the team? Who's doing all the work, or who gets all the credit? Better yet, we know who's doing the work. Who's getting all the credit, right? Who's going to get promoted on the back of that? Who's getting paid? Exactly. So how do we, and Joy, I'm going to invite you to start your brief presentation here. How can companies better engage their AAPI employees into the company's broader strategies for long-term growth and success, get them invested in the organization, and to really have them be a key player rather than a token player?
That's actually a perfect lead-in, this question about how do we shift from diversity to actually including Asians on our teams on an everyday level, and also allowing Asians to ascend up the corporate ladder. So to this question of how do we actually get Asians included on teams, I wonder how often this has happened to you, where you hire an Asian, he's on the team representing diversity, but in meetings, he doesn't speak up much. So his colleagues may assume that he has no ideas and he's not a leader. So why doesn't he speak up much? And why do they instantly assume that he should speak so much? And what does culture have to do with all of this? And I think what this shows is that actually the DEI question is a different question for different people in the room, for different groups in the room, as well as for different individuals in the room. So today I thought maybe I'd give you a few thoughts on the specific issues facing Asians in companies, and also some solutions that we've seen working based on what we've learned in our work. So when it comes to Asians, the Asian DEI questions inextricably link with this question of culture. What is culture? Oftentimes, especially in May, when we think of Asian culture, Asian heritage, we think of festivals and dragon boat races and dumpling cooking classes. What anthropologists call artifacts, which are the visible elements of culture. But just like the bulk of an iceberg happens below the waterline, same thing with culture. So below the waterline, you have the learned and shared patterns of any group of people. Okay, these are the unwritten rules of the game, or the way we do things around here, that every group evolves over time. It's these cultural differences below the waterline, which are the cultural differences that make a difference to individual and team performance. So when you think of culture, think learned and shared patterns.
okay, today. And when it comes to Asians, Asians speak and think. So one of the learn and share patterns is that we live in a corporate America which is highly individualistic, and corporate America, which is highly individualistic, so that speaking is the primary way that we express our individualism. So in corporate America, speaking is incredibly important. And if you don't speak, people may assume that you have no ideas, which will obviously be a very bad thing. But in Asian cultures, speaking is not as important. In fact, for deep thinking, we need silence, and that's why we have meditation. And silence allows everyone to reflect on what's been said. So I think that this question of why Asians don't speak up is a good entree into the overall research about culturally diverse teams or diverse teams versus homogeneous teams. When we look at the research around the world, we find that, in fact, diverse teams, multicultural teams, tend to fall into 3 clear buckets of performance, shown here in gold. So on the left side, you see that many diverse teams, actually some diverse teams, are polarizing. So these are teams where members are stereotyping each other, they're withholding information from each other, there's low trust. Most teams actually don't fall into that polarizing buckets. Most diverse teams fall into this bucket of minimizing. Minimizing is where the teams value cultural differences, but the leaders may miss or not really understand cultural differences so much, and as a result, cultural differences become an obstacle to performance. This is why we're seeing such low belonging, lack of progression up corporate hierarchy. There are some multicultural teams, some diverse teams who researchers are finding are creators. These are teams that create exceptional value. They outperform the homogeneous teams shown here on white. These are teams that bring products to market in rapid time, in record time, and they uncover markets that homogeneous teams have been unable to access. So I think the real question for us is, how do we move beyond diversity? How do we unlock superior performance from teams that are diverse? Let's take a closer look at that big category of minimizing teams, because in fact, researchers find that 66% of multicultural teams are in this category of minimizing. This is what it looks like. It looks like a leader who genuinely respects all team members and aims to create inclusion, but is unaware of the cultural basis of their own ideas and actions. So they're interested in cultural differences like festivals and customs, but they don't fully grasp those differences that make a difference to team performance, those cultural differences under the waterline. Therefore, they unintentionally enforce their personal cultural norms onto the team, which overshadows other cultural expressions on their teams. As a result, the team is culturally homogeneous, even if it is demographically diverse. And what happens then is that, trying to move forward, here we go. Minimizing then creates a very different experience for people who are native to the dominant culture versus people who are not native to the dominant culture. On the left side, you'll see that for cultural natives, to be authentic is to be effective. So the best career strategy is to be your full authentic self. Then you will be increasingly effective. There'll be repeated validation. People will not question your right to be in the room or question the way that you communicate or the way that you lead. So that will boost your confidence and boost your belonging. And there's a continuous reinforcing of your perspectives and your influence. The difference for cultural non-natives is that it goes in the other way. Now, this may look like the cultural natives have it really good, but in fact, what this does is it confines their worldview, and they start to feel like the way that I communicate, the way that I lead is the way, and they don't get much exposure to other cultures. So let's move into solutions. I just wanted to set up for you quickly how this question of teams and how teams operate really impact Asians. They especially impact Asians because 71% of Asian American adults in America are immigrants, and only 17% of all American adults are immigrants. Those Asian Americans who were born here, who may speak perfect English, are for the most part the children of those immigrants. So we're raised in Asian learned and shared patterns of communication and interaction. Meanwhile, because only 17% of all American adults are immigrants, corporate America runs unconsciously by Western norms. So actually, whether Asians are speaking and fully contributing on our team can be seen as a barometer of team effectiveness. Are your Asian team members speaking up? And if not, then the good news is you have an opportunity to expand your team's norms so that everyone can contribute more effectively. I'm just going to run very quickly through 5 specific solutions, and then we can follow up on them more if you like, or at other times. I hope you'll get an idea or two that you'll find useful. The first, as we said, it comes down to leaders. Whether a team is effective really does come down to leaders. And I worked as a CEO headhunter for a long time, and we can actually evaluate the effectiveness of any individual leader. And they move along this continuum. As we said, 66% of leaders are in this minimization phase where they assume commonality. We want to move them towards acceptance and adaptation. We assess leaders. This is a very busy slide. If you like, I think the slides will be available later on this conference website, or you can just email me and ask me for them. I'm at joy@themli.net. So what happens is we know what polarizing leaders are like. We see that in American society. There's an us versus them mentality. Minimization, we talked about that earlier. They assume commonalities. In acceptance, they deeply appreciate differences, but they may have a limited ability to adapt. For example, they might be like, I see an Asian, I know I'm not supposed to keep asking them where they're really from, but they may not really know how to enable that Asian to feel fully included. So we want to move toward leaders toward a situation where they can fluidly shift their perspectives and adapt their behaviors so that everyone can contribute fully. The organizational outcome under minimization is diminished productivity. All these people are not able to fully contribute in innovation. When leaders are in acceptance, the outcome's pretty much the same as a minimization because leaders aren't changing their behaviors yet. So it's when leaders are in adaptation that we get the innovation and agility and high performance that were promised under DEI and diversity. Here are some of the things that we're doing specifically. This is a large part of our work, is to assess leadership teams, empower leaders with the cultural knowledge and skills to leverage cultural differences, and enable them to effectively engage and mobilize team members and clients of all backgrounds. I'm just going to quickly run through these because I don't want to take up too much of your time. The second one is equipping Asian professionals with professional developments that meets their needs. We know from Asia Society research, professional development is the #1 thing that creates belonging, a sense of belonging and employee satisfaction, and that companies have consistently struggled to provide targeted professional development. This is a very important point because we find that when companies provide professional development that doesn't meet the needs of Asians, because most of it is sort of aimed at people assuming Western backgrounds, then what happens is ineffective when the leadership development doesn't work and the Asian doesn't become a leader. Oftentimes, the company will say, oh, I guess this person lacked leadership potential after all. And stereotypes of Asians as not leaders become further reinforced. So actually, ineffective leadership development has a detrimental effect. This is actually a roadmap. This is a 15-month roadmap that we're providing at a global material sciences program. And so it has, just like I've been at HR for a long time, but this is a step-by-step roadmap that takes learners from peak performer to extraordinary leader. I'll just point out that very importantly, there's a lightweight training component for the sponsors and managers of those Asians to help them understand how to be more effective global leaders and sponsors to their trainees. The goal of this training is not to westernize or make junior white people of Asians. It's to empower them to be fully effective and authentic with everyone and everywhere. Third, promote fair career pathways for Asian employees. The stereotypes of Asians, when Americans are asked, like, what do you think of a leader? They come up with these words like assertive, dominant, and charismatic. Traits associated with an ideal follower are highly competent, hardworking, and docile. So Asians face a double whammy, where the traits associated with leadership are exactly the opposite of the traits associated with Asians. And the traits associated with an ideal follower are exactly the same as the traits associated with Asians. So this creates something called role incongruence, where leaders will be less likely to promote or even to invest in Asian employees. But very interestingly, the research also shows that once Asians are in leadership roles, they're viewed as equally effective as their white American counterparts. So this implies a very simple and straightforward solution, which is to promote qualified Asians to leadership and board roles. And once we do that, we can debunk the biases of Asians as not leaders and also gain the benefit of Asian perspectives. Moving very quickly through the last two, we need to shift our teams from demanding culture fit, that idea of minimizing, to embracing culture add. On minimizing teams, what often happens is the loudest voices will win while others are silenced and demotivated. We want to move towards these types of values. Every teammate is important. Like Susan was saying, differences are opportunities for learning. We will succeed together. These are actually quite Asian values, I would point out. So we can take the Western values and integrate in Asian values through processes like these. And finally, powering top-line growth, right? So we want to increase productivity by allowing a third or half our workforce to contribute to their full potential. We can also leverage them to drive top-line growth. Asians are America's fastest growing business and consumer markets. In the last 20 years, they grew by 81% versus 70% for Latinos, 20% for African Americans, and 1% for whites. So for any company who's interested in growing in the United States, they can look to the future by better leveraging their Asian employees, not just relegating them to back office roles, but really leveraging them to access the fastest growing markets in the United States, and as well, their connections to over half of the world's markets. And there we go. There's a roadmap on this. Again, if anyone would like to have this to refer to later, I think it will be on the Asia Society website. You're welcome to find me on LinkedIn or to email me. Thank you very much.
Joy, thank you for that, especially the roadmap. I think we need more time to be able to look at it more carefully. I want to go back to something we mentioned at the start of this conversation, which is, of course, the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. The Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC, that ruling in June 2023. I mentioned how in the wake of that, there are a lot of concerns and scrutiny over corporate diversity initiatives. Companies are worried that they are going to be the target of a lawsuit. The question is this just worry, or is this actually a legitimate concern? And what are companies doing in response? What should companies consider doing in response? Jeanine, you have a presentation for us on this.
So I'll follow Joy's lead. So thank you for setting that up, Scarlet. We, out of the Students for Fair Admissions decision, as you all know, and Scarlett explained earlier, that it held that race-conscious admissions processes at UNC and Harvard were unconstitutional and violated Title VI. It did not say that there was a violation of Title VII, which is the statute that regulates employment laws. However, as I'm sure many of you have seen, Students for Fair Admission, after that decision, there have been a number of challenges outside of the educational context. There were a number of challenges to fellowship programs that many law firms had that held fellowship programs for those who are diverse, disadvantaged, or in historically underrepresented communities. They faced significant backlash and ultimately changed their fellowship programs to be open to all. But what they did do, and this was somewhat spelled out in the SFFA decision as well, is they do ask for a essay, information related to background, how diversity has impacted you and your life. After that, there were also challenges. You may have heard of Fearless Fund, a challenge that was brought under Section 1981. This is the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And essentially, they held that you are not contracting with particularly white individuals and others because there was a grant, a Strivers grant, that was solely for, and it was a $20,000 grant that was solely for Black women-owned businesses. And so the Section 1981 prevents you from discriminating against anyone in making or carrying out a contract. So we saw all of those challenges happening. There was also shareholder derivative suits that were being brought, first about DEI and not meeting DEI programs. We saw that after the murder of George Floyd. And then it was largely about DEI programs and are you doing what's right for your shareholders? So we saw conservative groups bringing litigation related to that. Ultimately, Eastern District of Washington Court said this is, for one particular derivative action, this is a business judgment related decision. The board looked into what they were doing and ruled that the company was doing what was right for their shareholders and what their shareholders wanted. So with all of that coming out, we heard that there were many companies that were drawing back on their D&I programs. And so our law firm put out a survey to several C-suite level executives, and we were able to get 320 of those executives that responded to the survey to see what, in fact, companies were doing. Because even though we were hearing that so many were pulling back, we were seeing that our clients were coming to us saying, look, our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are so critical to us, so critical to our culture. How do we maintain these programs? And what we actually saw was that, in fact, the majority, actually about 57% of those C-suite level executives, and we wanted people that were actually making decisions, were determining that they had, or stated that they had significantly increased, had increased moderately, or had slightly increased their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Now, that was the case even though 59%, about the same amount, said that they strongly agree that there had absolutely been a very big backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs after the SFFA decision. What we also found somewhat interesting is that there were still organizations that were saying they weren't totally clear on their plans and goals, and about 35% of those C-suite level executives were making those statements. So still a commitment, even though they recognized that there was a significant backlash after the Supreme Court decision. And so that was important for us to know, what are companies internally really doing? And we saw that, in fact, companies were seeking to maintain their DE&I programs. And so as Scarlet asked, is there still a risk? Is there still a concern? And the answer is yes, there certainly is. We've already seen those challenges, and we will certainly continue to see challenges. But as I mentioned before, I think what a lot of companies are doing is being very prudent to actually look over their programming and determine, are there risks that lie here? And what we know companies are doing is also making a risk assessment. Different companies have different risk tolerance levels. And so we as a firm are certainly helping to guide companies in relation to making those assessments. The fellowship programs, we saw a number of organizations, law firms, changing their fellowship programs, changing if they're providing incentives for having more diversity, and determining and changing those programs to make sure that you're not encouraging just an increase in numbers, but looking at programming to see, do I need to tweak the programming to get the types of numbers and to get the diversity that I want? I mentioned earlier, increasing the pools of applicant databases. We saw a lot of organizations that were never going to historically Black colleges and universities and other minority colleges and universities that are doing that, increasing their slates, making sure they have diversity on the panels that are interviewing. And so really looking into their programming and how do we make an effort and how do we make those changes, because we, as mentioned earlier, I think companies are recognizing why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so critical. The one thing that I also will point out with regards to the risk level is we saw a couple of weeks ago, there was actually another Supreme Court decision that came out called the Muldrow decision. A St. Louis police sergeant was actually transferred to another location and stated that she was being discriminated against because she was a woman, because she had different networking opportunities, there was a longer commute, there were varying different issues related to her transfer. And that decision, the Supreme Court actually held that instead of it being necessary to show that there's significant or materially adverse harm, just showing that there's harm is sufficient to make out a Title VII employment law claim. Now, what that means, the Supreme Court said, we don't know, but the lower courts will have to make that determination. And so the case law will start to play that out. But as you can see how that can increase, the number of cases that may not have been able to be brought before Muldrow that can be brought now. Now, a number of, again, conservative activists are saying this is going to impact D&I programs. But we know that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and other sort of remedial measures were being taken to ensure that individuals have opportunities. And those programs, in a lot of contexts, have been found absolutely lawful. And employment, interestingly enough, in employment law cases like we handle, some of my colleagues are here today, that we handle every day, there's a risk in every employment-related decision. And employment-related decisions should never be made on the basis of race, religion, color, any other protected category. And so companies do have to be vigilant that they are not doing that. But there's risk in every employment-related decision. There will continue to be, and taking those prudent measures, as I talked about earlier, can help any company ensure they're not violating Title VII. So thank you for your time.
We're going to start to wrap up our conversation here. I just have one more question for Susan as we look ahead, because it is a contentious election year. And of course, you have a presidential candidate who is voicing the grievances of white male Americans who feel they've been left behind. And that puts a lot of people who are people of color out on the sidelines. What advice, what actionable advice do you have to give companies who are looking for guidance on how to navigate their talent initiatives, hiring and retaining talent in the coming weeks and months?
Scarlet, Scarlet, for that question. I guess a couple of things I would suggest. One is it's very easy to get caught up in the rhetoric and the negative talk. And one of the things that I think that has helped us is to, sorry about that, Mike. It's very easy to get caught up in the negative talk and the rhetoric. And I think one of the things that's important is to sort of separate the rhetoric from what you know is important. So if you have a North Star as a company, focus on your North Star, focus on your why, and don't get caught up in the rhetoric. Doesn't mean you're ignoring it, doesn't mean you don't have to address it, but focus on your North Star. One of the things that we often remind people is that in any company, you will have people on every end of the political spectrum. And so the value that you attach to DE&I shouldn't shift. It should not shift with the wind, the value that you attach to DE&I. And so focus on your North Star, focus on your why, and stay true to that. And quite frankly, I think leave the political rhetoric outside. We have core values at the firm. One of them is commit to diversity and inclusion. So it doesn't matter whether we're pro DE&I, the world, I should say, is pro DE&I or anti DE&I. DE&I still matters for us. The last thing I'll say, Scarlett, is on a personal level, I think we shouldn't ignore the impact of the rhetoric though on us personally. So corporate North Star, focus on that. Personal level, please, I would encourage everybody, try not to consume too much of that. There's a harm that we don't attach enough importance to, and that is the mental and physical harm that comes with the negative rhetoric. And when we consume it and we wallow in it and we repeat it and we spend all our time talking about it, I personally don't practice that. I'm not unaware, I'm aware, and I do the work that I need to do to help the firm, but I don't personally wallow in it and spend time listening to this on repeat when I'm in my home. The sanctity of my home, I protect. And so I would say focus on it, but don't let it become the center of your personal existence. And then corporations, if you're out there, focus on your North Star and don't let the political rhetoric change your North Star.
Thank you so much. Susan, Jeanine, and Joy, it's been a privilege.
Thank you so much. Thank you.